Welcome to the Pulse Podcast, Living Abundantly, Wholeheartedly. I'm your host, Matthew Rattan. Since a pulse doesn't mean you're alive, this podcast is about the vitality of firm faith, pursuing personal integrity, and consistently keeping the main thing in practical ways day by day. My guest today is Paul Carter, and let me just give you some background about him and introduce our topic. So Paul is the happy husband of Shauna Lee and the proud father of 5 children. He attended Moody Bible Institute, is a graduate of York University, we have that in common, and McMaster Divinity College, where he got his Master of Divinity degree. He has been in pastoral ministry since 1994. For you baseball fans, that's the year the World Series was canceled. I'm sure he remembers that. So, and he served in both fellowship and Canadian Baptist churches in Oakville, Mississauga, and Orillia, Canada, where he presently serves as the lead pastor of Cornerstone Baptist Church, which has a passion for biblical preaching and local mission. He's a council member of the Gospel Coalition Canada, which exists to foster and to encourage gospel renewal in our nation. And he's the host and Bible teacher on Into the Word, the podcast, which you can find on iTunes, Google Play, and you can follow him on Twitter with the handle at Pastor Paul Carter. Pastor doesn't have an O. He's also a Blue Jays fan, as his Twitter feed will tell you. And yeah, I can't believe Vladdy, 17 homers. Crazy season, I know. Our topic is Christian persecution in Canada. What is it? Is there any? What is the difference between that and losing influence in the culture generally? And how do we respond? So a lot of people in North America don't realize it, but according to Open Doors Canada, 260 million Christians around the world experience high levels of persecution because of their faith in Jesus. Globally, that's about 1 in every 8 Christians. They say every day an average of 8 Christians are killed for their faith, and 23 Christians are raped or sexually harassed for faith-related reasons. Every week, an average of 182 churches or Christian buildings are attacked, and 276 Christian homes burned or destroyed. Every month, an average of 309 Christians are unjustly imprisoned for their faith. So with that bit of background, Paul, thanks so much for just sharing some of your time and just coming on the podcast.
That's great. I'm glad to be talking about this.
So how do you define persecution?
Well, persecution is, notoriously hard to define. It's kind of like art. You know it when you see it, but definitely there's some subjectivity there. The Bible does not define persecution. It doesn't contain a definition, but there's a paragraph. Jesus has a paragraph that comes pretty close. In Matthew 23, 34 to 35, he says, "Therefore, I send you prophets and wise men and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify, and some you will flog in your synagogues and persecute from town to town, so that on you may just blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar." So there it sounds like the bar's pretty high. We've got people being crucified, people being killed, there's blood, there's murder, they're being harassed and harried, chased from place to place. So that sounds like persecution to me. That's a high bar. Jesus isn't talking there about losing tax status or how much money the government gives you or what the seating capacity is in your sanctuary. He's talking about some pretty serious stuff. So, the actual Greek word used there in that passage is dioko, which means to pursue, to harass or harry. And so I think there's a notion of being specifically targeted. And that's where this conversation gets interesting with respect to our present experiences under COVID, right? Are these health regulations that we all find difficult, are they intended to harass, harry, single out Christians? And I would have a hard time arguing that they are. I mean, by and large, Christian churches have been treated basically the same as movie theaters and barbershops and gyms. Whether you think these are helpful or not, they are targeted at a virus, not a religious movement, right? And the only reason they're impacting us is because we have lungs, we breathe. This is targeting a virus that spreads really well in indoor environments where people are breathing heavy, right? And Christians are in that category, but we're in that category with a lot of other people.
Yeah, no, I think that's a helpful thing to highlight too as well. I appreciate that verse too, right? These are serious things, not only pursuing, but also kind of physical. So I had the idea for this talk after reading a piece you did for the Gospel Coalition Canada called, "What if we had 50 years before the outbreak of formal persecution in Canada?" So part of the reason why that grabbed my attention was because, I've been learning more about persecution globally through organizations like Open Doors, which tracks these kinds of things, but also thinking about it more in our own culture especially as things are quickly changing in Canada, and not always in a way that is favorable towards Christian faith and teachings. I was particularly intrigued with the timeline. 50 years, like right now it's 2021. So 50 years from now would be 2071. So can you summarize a bit of the background to the piece and kind of what compelled you to write it?
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, to be honest with you, a lot of my writing is just the overflow of Bible study and other stuff I'm doing. And a lot of the blogs I write are actually the overflow of stuff I do for Into the Word. So I had just recently finished, I don't know if we'd published yet, but we had just finished the series on First Peter. And so I was kind of thinking about that timeline. When I wrote the article, it says, what if there was 50 years before formal persecution in Canada or whatever? And I think a lot of people I've learned don't read articles. They just read titles or headlines. And so a lot of people thought I was saying we won't face persecution in Canada for 50 years, but that's not at all what I was saying. I was saying, let's just step into this story. And the story is, Peter writes First Peter in AD 63. He writes to a group of people who are facing some discrimination. Based on what we know, it seems that they were being pushed out of trade guilds. They were losing social status, social favor, but they weren't being formally persecuted. Thankfully, we know an awful lot about the posture of the Roman government in this area through the official record. So we know that they weren't facing formal persecution. So Peter's trying to write to them and say, hey, just calm down a little bit. Let's right size these challenges that we're facing. Let's not panic. So that was AD 63. They were not formal state persecution in Bithynia, the province of Bithynia, where that letter was sent, until the year AD 112. In AD 112, a guy named Pliny the Younger was sent by the Emperor Trajan to be governor of that province. And he was a classic bureaucrat. So he didn't do anything without writing reports. And he always asked for permission and for suggestions. And so we just have a ton of information about what was going on at that time. In AD 112, he arrived and was astonished by the number of Christians in the area. There were so many Christians that it was affecting the local economy, which is great because it means obviously those people heeded Peter's counsel. They didn't allow themselves to get distracted. They didn't allow themselves to become antagonistic towards their neighbors. They kept on doing their jobs and making disciples. And it sounds like they made an awful lot of disciples, so much so that Pliny reports to Trajan that it had disrupted even the agricultural trade because people weren't buying the same sacrificial animals that were used previously in pagan worship. And so he says, I'm going to look a little deeper into this. So he arrests and tortures a number of Christians. He writes an extensive report on that. He talks about arresting 2 female deaconesses that he said were slaves. So I guess we presume they were slaves during the day, and they functioned within their church community as deaconesses and helped female converts and whatnot. Anyway, they were insiders. So he tortured them and got a ton of historically fascinating information on what happens inside Christians' conversation. But he sent all this in a report to the Emperor Trajan. And he said, what would you like me to do? And Trajan wrote back and basically commended the ancient version of the don't ask, don't tell policy. He said, do not ferret them out. Don't go looking for them, right? So if the word persecution, dioko, means to ferret out, to go looking, to target specific, he said, don't do that. He says, now, don't make it easy for them. He said, we want to make it as easy as possible for people to leave Christianity and return to paganism. So some disincentives, but no formal fatal persecution. That was the policy. And it held steady basically till 323 AD. In 323 AD, this province had become the capital of the Eastern Empire. This was at a time when the Eastern and Western empires were separated. And the Emperor Licinius was in his capital seat. And by this point, the Western Empire under Constantine had converted to Christianity, at least nominally or officially. And so Licinius came to view all the Christians in his region as potential agents of Constantine. And so he enacted in this region formal fatal persecution. They burned down a bunch of churches. They arrested notable Christian figures, bishops, pastors, chopped them into little bits and threw them into the Black Sea. That's persecution. They were ferreting them out and they were subjecting them to significant torture and disincentive, right? So that happened in 323. But if you do the math, that's 200 years. 200 years where the don't ask, don't tell policy from AD 112 held steady. So the lesson in all that, the lesson in that timeline is, when people will say, oh, the persecution's just around the corner. historically speaking, it tends to stay just around the corner as a threat, as a rumor. And so really a lot of the challenge of the Christian life is not overreacting, not assuming that just because it happened there, it's going to happen here. And just because it started means it's going to escalate. It often doesn't. And there's an awful lot of work and ministry that can be done in the time when it's just around the corner. You know, basically the Christian life is lived perpetually in that 5 minutes to midnight on the doomsday clock. Trouble is always right around the corner. We're one heartbeat away from disaster, always, right? Mm-hmm. That's actually a good place for faith. And it's actually a good place for witness too.
Yeah. I just want to, I really appreciate that historical context too, and just how we're actually going back and looking, you know, at a New Testament document. And we'll get into that more in a second too. But the historical background always, you know, brings color and makes it much more real to us, and we can maybe relate to it in our own situation. But before we move on, I just want to ask you about, you said a phrase that I just hoping you could flesh out a little bit. You said, you know, Peter writes to help them right size the situation. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the issue, right? I think Christians are always inclined to catastrophize and to exaggerate, right. And that's always been true. So there's some comfort in that. I think that's our struggle right now. And
you mean like perspective, like regaining perspective as to how things are relative to reality. Okay.
That's right. Okay. Yeah, Thomas Schreiner, I don't have the quote in front of me, but Thomas Schreiner has a great line where in his commentary on 1 Peter, where he says there's no evidence of formal persecution. What they're facing was discrimination and social marginalization.
Right.
Yeah, that's very similar to where we're at right now.
Right. Kind of the looks over the shoulders and the kind of down the nose of people. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think in evangelicalism right now in North America, that's what we're dealing with, right? The loss of cultural privilege, the loss of power, the loss of significant status. I mean, one of the things this pandemic has revealed, I think it's one of the reasons people are so angry, or some are so angry, is it's revealed how little the government thinks about us when they make protocols and regulations. They don't have to. We're not a significant block. And so at every point when the rules changed, we had to contact the local health unit to find out, how does this apply to churches? And they'd be like, churches, you say? As if there are Christians in our neighborhood. Oh, we're not a significant power block. We're not a significant interest group. And I think a lot of folks are waking up to that and waking up angry.
So what was Peter's specific advice to those early believers? Can you highlight some of the things he says? Okay, so it's not around it's not ready immediately, could be off in the future. And you've kind of talked about this 50 years to kind of give us kind of a somewhere to hang our hat. But what was Peter's specific advice to those early believers about how they're to live in that situation, dealing with this kind of social ostracization and these types of things?
Yeah, well, I mean, read 1 Peter 3. It's a great chapter for this time period in our lives. I mean, he says, now who is there to harm you if you're eager for good, right? So let's just keep that in mind. If the best way to maximize our permission in the culture is by being known for good works, right? That's literally our best defense against government encroachment, against social disfavor, right? Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who's in heaven. So, he's just repeating the counsel Jesus gave. So do your good works, right? And be respectful, be civil. He talks about when you are engaged with folks in the culture, do it with gentleness and respect. So we're not to be fighting for our rights. I hate that terminology. How do we go from following a savior who was crucified naked on a Roman cross to fighting for our right to exist at the center of cultural power, right? The apostle of the Hebrews actually says, go outside the gates. Jesus was crucified outside the gate. Go outside and bear reproach with him. So I don't understand fighting for our central position and our power in the culture. And so, Peter says, make sure you're engaging with gentleness and respect. Do your thing. If you do suffer, oh boy, he says, make sure you're suffering for doing good and not for being a jerk. And entrust yourself.
That's the message version of that verse.
Yeah, that's the message. That's the amplified version. Yeah. And he says, 1 Peter 4:19, entrust your souls to a faithful creator, right? And he talks about this testing comes anyway from God. It's God who holds the devil's leash, right? So we talk about how these threats are always right around the corner and they generally stay there. That's fine for the devil, right? Because he just wants to make noise to get us distracted and get us fearful and get us angry. But every once in a while, God does lengthen the chain and the bark becomes bite. But, Peter says that's actually God's will. It tests us. It refines us. It serves the church. Interesting. We were talking about history of Bithynia. Of course, after 323 and 324, there was a civil war between the East and the West. Licinius lost. And so Constantine became the emperor over the whole empire. And Christianity was not just legalized, it was preferred. And a lot of historians say it took us 1,000 years to recover from that victory. Christianity actually, sometimes you got to be careful what you ask for. The absence of persecution does not always result in the healthiest and most mature and vibrant church.
Yeah. I'm glad you raised the whole idea about manner in terms of gentleness and respect, because I think that, one of the things about social media and the internet about our time is that people get on there right away, and it feels like people are fighting more, or they're saying things and doing so in an ungracious way. There's not that sober second thought. And I think for some of the good things about technology, some of the bad things too, is it hurts our witness. Are you seeing that as well? And what counsel do you have for people who have that instinct to jump on and to say these things, which maybe without that kind of pause, waiting, light shining impulse?
Yeah. One of the things, I'm a middle-aged pastor. And so, one of the things I'm often saying to younger folks for whom social media is, it's just the air they breathe. It's their native land, it's their native language. I said, just remember, whenever you do anything, whenever you're doing anything in the public square, you need to be asking more than what do I have the right to say? You have the right to say anything, almost anything you want in this culture. But as a Christian, you need to be asking, what is helpful? What will make Jesus look good? What will advance the message? From 1 Corinthians 8 to 10, the Apostle Paul is talking about that. He's saying, hey, listen, you got all these rights. Marvelous. He says, I got all these rights too. Wonderful. I'm willing to do without almost all. Like, I'm willing to lay down. I'm willing to operate well inside the extent of my rights for the sake of gospel ministry. And that's a mindset that a lot of us have lost. We just feel like I have the right to be angry. I have the right to complain about the government. I have the right to express. Sure, marvelous. Not sure it's helpful though, and not sure it makes Christians look good. Ideally, in a time of crisis, I'd like for Christians to be known as loving, faithful, joyful people. Unfortunately, I'm concerned that in this crisis, we look angry, demanding, and divisive. And a lot of that just has to do with, I would just say, sloppy or careless use of social media.
Let's focus continually on this Canadian context that we are in. This is where this is being recorded from. The privileged place of Christians in Canada is on the wane, and we've talked about this. Even though many people identify with some sort of faith, according to census data, that's a long way, as we both know, from actual practicing Christians. Yeah. So a few of the changes that might highlight this fading influence are, end of the Lord's Day Act, which had made it illegal to do business on Sundays. Something else is, how the Lord's Prayer isn't really said in public settings. I think of as much as it used to. I remember growing up in Bracebridge, Ontario, which is, about half an hour north of where you are. And an hour where I am, it's like at the start of elementary school, you sang O Canada and you said the Lord's Prayer. And then as we went through, you sang O Canada and you observed a moment of silence. And then at the end, we just listened to O Canada. It was like this kind of slow switch. And like now, the only time I hear really outside of church the Lord's Prayer, other than our devotions, is maybe at a Remembrance Day event. That's kind of it. But that isn't persecution. That's more like losing influence. Actually, I just want to share a quote. This book, Mark Knoll, What Happened to Christian Canada, and he says something which he says is kind of like a bit of a historical snapshot. He says, get this, on September 15th, 1959, Georges Vanier was installed as Canada's 19th Governor General, the Queen's formal representative in her Canadian Dominion. Vanier, much decorated general, diplomat, and active Roman Catholic, began his acceptance speech like this: Mr. Prime Minister, my first words are a prayer. May Almighty God, in his infinite wisdom and mercy, bless the sacred mission which has been entrusted to me by Her Majesty the Queen, and help me to fulfill it in all humility. In exchange for his strength, I offer him my weakness. May he give peace to this beloved land of ours, and to those who live in it, the grace of mutual understanding, respect, and love. End quote. And he uses that as a bit of a springboard to talk about how that influence in that central place has changed. So can you explain the difference between losing a place of influence and then outright persecution? And you've already lent to this a little bit, but just kind of reflect on that.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and I think that's a lot of what the evangelical trauma of this moment is about. And it's a little muted. I used to say 10 years ago, I used to say the problem in Canada is that evangelicals sneeze whenever our American cousins get a cold. But now I think actually it's not just that we're sneezing in sympathy. Now I think whatever we catch because of the internet. So it's almost like we're borrowing trauma, which is an interest. Somebody should write a paper on that. But at the end of the day,
you can do it.
The reality is we are losing influence in the culture. But of course, the reality is, who promised you influence in the culture, and who promised you a place at the middle? Like again, the apostle to the Hebrews says, "Come outside the gate." Jesus was crucified outside the gate. Come outside and bear the reproach of Christ. So actually, Christianity is designed to function at the margins. And in fact, I think any observer of Christian history would argue we tend to be at our worst when we're in power. Christianity functions best at the margins. We function best as salt and light, calling people out of darkness into marvelous light. Christianity is subversive, not seditious. So anyway, long story short, I think because we went through this unusual historical moment where for the better part of the last 200 years, we have been in the driver's seat, or at least I would say in Canada, we were never in the driver's seat as evangelicals, but we were at least in the front seat. And now we've, over the space of 50 years, we've gone from the front seat to the back seat to the trunk. And nobody wants to hear from us anymore. And if we make a lot of noise, they're going to open the trunk and hit us with a bat. And so that's a trauma, right? There's just a lot of anxiety over that. But again, the loss of power and privilege is not persecution. Ross Douthat wrote about this, writing in the New York Times to American Christians. But what he said obviously is applicable here more so because I think we have actually some better protections and we had less of a history of privilege anyway. But Ross wrote in the New York Times, he said, being marginalized, being sued, status, this will be uncomfortable, but we should keep perspective and remember our sins, and nobody should call it persecution. And then he chastises the Christian for catastrophizing and hyperventilating every time we lose an inch of our cultural power. He says, using the persecution label too promiscuously doesn't do enough to acknowledge the vast gulf separating the situation of Western Christians and the incredible heroism of our co-believers overseas who face eliminative violence on an increasingly dramatic scale. And he says that it doesn't actually prepare conservative believers for a future as a hopefully creative religious minority because it conditions them to constantly expect some kind of grand tribulation that probably won't actually emerge. I thought that's a great quote, and regardless of your eschatology, Douthat is right, historically speaking, right? Had the Christians in Bithynia Pontus developed a tribulation complex, if they had lived their whole lives like what's around the corner is coming, it's coming, they would have missed out on 50 years of peace and opportunity, and then another further 200 years of peace and opportunity.
Yeah,
so I think he's right.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. And I think in the quote, one of the way from the article you did, I think one of the ways you said it was like, yeah, if you're just hiding out in the basement, thinking that this massive hammer is going to drop on you, you're going to miss all these opportunities to talk about Jesus and do good work. So absolutely. I feel like, I want to ask, what maybe some examples of things that you think could be on the horizon. It's kind of speculative, so I don't know what you want to say about that, but do you see, based on current cultural trends, this and might happen? And I'm not saying these are the same as being chopped into bits and your pastor being thrown into Lake Ontario, or there's so many things. If you're watching the right news sources, you see things of actual physical harm and death and burnings being built in other parts of the world. I'm not saying they're the same, but do you see some, based on our cultural landscape here, some kind of things on the horizon specifically for us that we might have to deal with? Yeah, I do. And actually, that's one of the reasons why I think I want to be careful about saving this word till we need it. Because I do think it's on the horizon in one respect. Now, I mean, it could be right around the corner for my whole lifetime. But yeah, I remember not too long ago being before COVID, but being in a workshop or a seminar with Dr. Michael Haken, and it was a seminar on the Baptist experience in England and how particular Baptists face some difficulties with the established church. And he mentioned some hardships that they dealt with. And just as an aside, as an anecdotal comment, I just remember thinking it was quite interesting that he would throw that out anecdotally.
He said, I suspect that Baptist pastors in Canada will face jail time in my lifetime for teaching what the Bible says on gender and sexuality. And I agree. I agree 100%. I think that it feels to me like that is coming again. Just because it feels like it's coming doesn't mean it is, but it feels to me like that is the looming possibility.
Yeah, no, I would say that. And, I'm not sure the exact context he was speaking in. I think it could be any evangelical pastor in general.
He was speaking to Baptists, so that's why he said that. But I'm sure he would have said the same thing to Presbyterians.
Yeah. Some of us anyway. But is there a positive side of losing cultural influence? Like, I think sometimes people will talk about that and they think it's persecution. It's not. It's really losing cultural influence, as we've discussed. But that's not necessarily a bad thing all the way. So you've talked about, having this, creative place, being salt and light outside the city wall, etc. What are some of the other benefits for losing that influence?
Well, it's an interesting time to be having that conversation, right? Right now, we're sort of all traumatized and reacting and repenting and reflecting upon the residential school, just disaster. I don't know what other word to use for it. It's a great example of what happens when Christians have too much power and are at the center of of society and our socializing efforts, and those things mix in weird, strange ways that have horrific consequences. So. I think Christianity does better from the margins when it's more of a movement, less of an institution, when it's more about gospel witness, less about political control. Christianity is meant to leaven. We're meant to be near enough to be seen. We have to be seen to have influence. But this world is not our home. We're ambassadors of a coming kingdom. The ambassador for Sweden is not running for president. The ambassador from Japan is not running for prime minister. I mean, there needs to be a limit on the amount of political power we attempt to seize and control. Our focus is somewhere else. And we pursue cultural change at our best. We pursue it downstream from gospel change, right? So Jesus didn't send us out to change the world. He didn't send us out to control the culture. He sent us out to make disciples. Now, when we make disciples, when we do what we're told, we change the world and we influence the culture. But anytime we try to put the cart before the horse, or anytime we try to get ahead of the process and seize power directly, bad things happen. So, I think Christianity just was designed to thrive at the margins. It's interesting. Sometimes people say, "Oh, persecution is good for the church too," right? There's kind of the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. Yeah. I'm not sure history bears that out very well. First of all, there's far less formal fatal persecution in church history than most people assume. Most people just sort of assume it was really, really bad, and until 1950 or so. And when you read history, you realize it's often intermittent. And now there are countries in the world where it's consistent and brutal, and those places are extremely difficult. But most of church history, it was intermittent. But where it was sustained, right? So you think of parts of Africa, you think of Eastern Europe, where that has been a sustained effort. After communism, Christianity really doesn't thrive in those areas. It's like the ground has been salted, and it's extreme. So I would say actually doesn't tend to lead to great growth in the church. Intermittent persecution actually tends to, almost like fertilizer, leads to growth. But I would say sustained persecution is not good for growth. And I would also say neither is cultural power. You think of Constantine. F.F. Bruce, in his book, A Spreading Flame, I think it was he who used the phrase, "It took us 1,000 years to recover from that victory," talking about Constantine over Licinius. Yeah. There
seems to be something about, an intoxicating quality with popularity or influence, right? And it kind of all of a sudden becomes about that, and Jesus ceases to be at the center of what you are pursuing in a way. And I wonder if when people say, I forget the source, is it Augustine, the blood of the seed is sort of the blood of the martyrs.
Tertullian, wasn't it?
Tertullian? Maybe. I should look it up. But I wonder if people are commenting really on how, when they cite that it can have a refining quality. Sure. Or a clarifying. So all of a sudden when, this nominal Christianity where people might identify as Christian, but really they're not really seeking to follow the Lord. It's just something that's kind of in their, they might say grace at dinner and go to church once in a while, but they're not really being disciples of Jesus. So in this sense, persecution kind of like, oh, do you mean this? Is this something, a way of life that you have? So my sense is people are kind of referring to that. But final thought, and I've really appreciated your insights and in your time here. But so in the letter, Peter has advice for them. Would you kind of, I wonder if you might kind of, share what that advice might be for us today, as disciples of a time of more formal persecution is indeed coming. Maybe if that's around the corner, or if that's 50 years from now or beyond. Yeah.
So in terms of specific advice that Peter offers, I think the most obvious is don't exaggerate your difficulties, right? Who is there to harm you if you're eager for doing good? Stay focused, do good, expect intermittent persecution. He goes on to say, but even if you should suffer, right, you'll be blessed. Keep in mind, Peter heard the Sermon on the Mount, right? He had a front row seat for that. Jesus said, rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. So, the attitude of the disciples seems to have been, peace is good because you can get more work done on a sunny day, but persecution's good too, because you rack up bonus points, right? Bonus rewards in heaven. Jesus used that language, be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. So, Peter's advice is, don't live like it's here if it's not, but also don't live in terror of it. Don't let persecution define you, and don't let it make you angry. That's another thing he says. Do it with gentleness and respect. When you are reviled, he says, do not revile in return, pointing to the example of Christ. So don't let it define you. Don't let it make you angry. And then interestingly, I think you could make the argument as we move from 1 Peter to 2 Peter, in 2 Peter, Peter's counsel seems to be, don't be so obsessed with external threats that you become unmindful of threats growing up on the inside. In 2 Peter, the focus is very different. He's not talking about external threats anymore. He's actually saying you've allowed threats to grow up on the inside, and you've got false doctrine running through the church. You've allowed things in that you shouldn't have, and sometimes that happens when we become so obsessed with the threats on the outside. We allow things to grow up on the inside. We become blind to things. I mean, let me ask you a question. What's the greater threat to the long-term future of the church in Canada? Government regulations or massive in the church itself?
I think it's internal. I think it's 100%. Internal. I don't know how anyone would argue that. Yeah. So anyway, I think that's Peter's counsel, and I think it's remarkably relevant and applicable today. Thanks for listening to the Pulse Podcast. I invite you to subscribe, or maybe even leave a review on your favorite podcasting app. It helps spread the word. You can also sign up for the Up Daily Devotional that I write at theupdevo.com. Let's live abundantly, wholeheartedly.